Good evening and welcome to session 9 of the 2020 Champlain Institute titled A More or Less Perfect Union. We had another good day today. We began the day with a session on how we eat now, featuring Sam Sifton of the New York Times and Francis Stead Sellers of the Washington Post. Later in the morning, we heard about the struggle for America, a fascinating conversation between two writers, Frances Fitzgerald and Roxana Robinson. In all of our sessions this week and in tonight's session, we continue to reflect on how much is at stake for our not very united country in 2020. It's not just that we are fighting a powerful epidemic. Today was another difficult day, and we share condolences with the family of Herman Cain. It also is about how broken our politics can feel, but there are glimmers of hope, and one is that our Constitution has girded the ship of state and helped us through some very rough weather over 233 years. Another is that we know from our history and from our friendships on this island that bipartisanship does work. It was encouraging today to see three presidents from two parties speak at the funeral service for John Lewis. And our next speaker knows something about bipartisanship. C. Boyden Gray is well known to people on this island and to all Americans for his distinguished service to his country from the Marine Corps in the 1960s to his service in 3 Republican administrations, beginning with that of Ronald Reagan, where he was the legal counsel to Vice President George H.W. Bush, then as White House counsel in the presidency of George H.W. Bush, and again in the presidency of his son, George W. Bush, when he served as the U.S. ambassador to the European Union. But in talking with him just a few minutes before our program began, he told me a fascinating story about how he helped engineer the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, an act for which all Americans and all people here in this beautiful place owe him a great debt of gratitude. And as he needed to build bipartisan support for that very important measure, he reached across the aisle to many Democratic senators, but one who was especially cooperative was Senator George Mitchell, who gave us such a stirring speech last night. So again, Mount Desert Island shows us a very good way forward, and all of us here on the island are delighted to begin tonight's session on A More or Less Perfect Union. Please welcome C. Boyden Gray.
It is indeed a great honor and privilege to introduce Doug Ginsburg, who you will find, I think, after you've heard him and watched some of the films that he's participated in, both tonight, snippets, and in greater length at your leisure. He is a crown jewel of our legal system, one of the most important figures, and one of the most literate about the Constitution. And I will talk a little bit about that later, but I first want to say something about the role of an introducer. As we all know, one introducer was invited and then disinvited, very regrettably. I still don't understand why. I think it's a dark moment for this campus. I guess one of the reasons is there's some disagreement with his values. And as an individual who admires Leonard and has known him for a long, long time, I wish we all had his values. Sure, he advocated for certain judges, but that's free speech. He wasn't deciding anything, and even if he were, elections do have consequences. People probably think the Federalist Society, which he helped build, is some sort of secret society with secret handshakes and secret emails. For those who don't know about it, maybe that's the way they feel. For those who do know, it's the most open debating society, I think, in the United States today. Every single conference that they put on, whether it's student, whether it's national, whether it's regional, every conference, every panel is evenly divided ideologically. There are no weighted. It's not like a network panel of 2 to 1, 3 to 1, or sometimes 4 to 1 on one side. It's about as bipartisan as you could possibly get. I do not know of any leading liberal academic or judge who has been rejected or ignored. They come in droves when they are invited, and everyone has a delicious, although not necessarily always agreed time. But it's a big magnet. This thing that he helped build. He's also a man of deep faith, a great family man, very high ranking in the Catholic Church, and I'm certain that's not a value that could cause his rejection. I think it's very regrettable, and I'm very sorry it's happened. Perhaps I should have also, in concert, to being in concert with him, to have refused to come here and introduce Doug. But as some of you may know, he married my sister-in-law, and therefore I use that to claim him as my brother-in-law. And I was not going to abandon my claimed brother-in-law and someone with whom I have worked over the years for a long, long time. As I say, he's the crown jewel, clerked on the D.C. Circuit, clerk for Justice Marshall on the Supreme Court, taught at the Harvard Law School, was head of the Antitrust Division at the Department of Justice, ran the most powerful agency no one's ever heard of in the executive branch dealing with regulation in the Office of Management and Budget, and then became a judge on the D.C. Circuit, and eventually its chief judge. He was so deeply admired by the Supreme Court for keeping bad cases from getting into their hands or their difficult situations, that when he said or announced his retirement as chief judge, there was panic and terror on the Supreme Court because they were worried that all of a sudden they would be deluged with bad cases that they would have to unscramble. I'm happy to say he had the wisdom to appoint or to allow or lead the appointment of a very esteemed successor. It is also true the successor was a law school classmate of mine, which adds to my connections to Judge Ginsburg. But he will, I think, talk to you in a way that will entertain you, teach you, and want you to read and learn a lot more. So without taking any more of his time or your time, please, Judge Ginsburg.
Thank you, Boyden.
I should add that he will be interviewed by Alan Crain, who's sort of a renegade from Houston. I don't blame him. The heat down there is really bad.
Thank you, Boyden. Thanks very much. And before we begin, Alan, if you'll give me a moment, I want to say that I too am a great friend and admirer of Leonard Leo. And the reason that I'm here, nonetheless, and that Boyden is here, is that in the real world, honorable people keep their commitments. In too many colleges today, that is not true. As one of the administrators here said in a message, the college caved into the mob. And I'm afraid that's true. We're coming up on 400 years since Galileo was accused of heresy for disagreeing with the reigning ideas of the moment. And all too often we see in the news here in this country something very much like that going on. And if it's a private institution like this, it's not unlawful, it's not unconstitutional, it's just extremely regrettable, and in many cases like this, shameful. Alan?
Well, Judge Ginsburg, it's always an honor to be with you, and always an honor to be with Boyden Gray. He teased me about Houston, but he did come and allow me to visit him there once, so maybe he didn't tell you that before we do our interview tonight. But our program is called A More or Less Perfect Union. It's named after your show, the PBS special that you spent over 3 years to prepare, and it started airing on the stations, PBS stations around the country. And we agreed that tonight you'll start off with some snippets from that and some commentary. So I always wanted to say this to a circuit court judge. Would you like to proceed now?
Thank you, Alan. Well, to lay the groundwork, I should say that there is, believe it or not, a debate in the legal community, and particularly in the academic legal circles, over whether our Constitution should be read as it's written or whether it can be tampered with by courts and revised as the courts see it needs to be for modern conditions. Of course, there is a process for amending the Constitution. It's been amended 27 times, perhaps 28, depending upon whether the Equal Rights Amendment has been validly ratified. We'll find out soon, I think. So we start with a little excerpt from a case in 1803, Marbury versus Madison, the most prominent, or perhaps the most consequential case in the history of the Supreme Court, when the great Chief Justice John Marshall wrote these words, speaking of a written constitution: the powers of the legislature are, are defined and limited, and those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten. The Constitution is written. To what purpose are powers limited, and to what purpose is that limitation committed to writing? If these limits may at any time be passed by those intended to be restrained, the distinction between a government with limited and unlimited powers is abolished if these limits do not confine the persons on whom they are imposed, and if acts prohibited and acts allowed are of equal obligation. Well, the court went on to say that it would hold up statutes and later on acts of the executive, the president and his subordinates, to the Constitution to ask whether in the document they can find the authority for what the Congress or the executive have done. And if not, then it is void. And to quote the court, it is emphatically the duty of the judiciary to say what the law is. That was in 1803. And that was the prevailing view of the Constitution of the United States for well over a century. I'll give you a sample here from, if I could see the next slide, from 1905. In a sick case from South Carolina against the United States. The Constitution is a written instrument. As such, its meaning does not alter. That which it meant when adopted, it means now. Being a grant of powers to a government, its language is general. And as changes come in social and political life, it embraces in its grasp all new conditions which are within the scope of the powers and terms conferred. There is no manner that this in no manner abridges the fact of its changeless nature and meaning. Those things which are within its grants of power, as those grants were understood when made, are still within them, and those things not within them remain still excluded. A lot of people think that that idea is one in which we should be looking at the intention of the framers when they wrote the Constitution. But Alan, it's a fond idea that one could discern the intention of a large body of people. It makes about as much sense as saying, we have a headache. I mean, we know what they wrote. We know what the words, more or less know what the words meant at the time, what they would have been understood to mean by the public who were asked to ratify the convention, the Constitution in their state conventions. And we shouldn't be thinking about their intention. That is not what's at stake. What's at stake is what they bequeathed us in writing. It can be informed by other writings, by dictionaries, by legal documents. Many of the phrases in the Constitution come from prior English and American case and statutory law, but it's not a question of anyone's intentions. So this has not been, that was 1905, that excerpt, but this has not been the constant watchword of our, well, of any of our three branches of government, really. So let's take a look at what's happened here. This is the Commerce Clause. And it's very simple. By the way, the whole is very simple. It was meant to be understood by the people who are affected by it. Bear in mind, the Constitution does not govern us. It governs those who do govern us. And we need to know what their authorities are and what they're not authorized to do. So the Commerce Clause, very simple. The Congress, if we could have the slide. We put the slide up?
The written constitution.
No, there you go. The Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. It couldn't be more simple. Commerce is trade. We've got no question about that as to what commerce meant at the time. And among the several states referred to trade that crossed a state line and went from one state to another. So goods, services would be hard to do in those days, interstate. Now we have the internet. But goods that moved across a state line could be regulated, and transactions in goods that moved across a state line could be regulated by the Congress and by the federal government if the Congress passed a law. But that hasn't been sufficient to satisfy the ambitions of many in government. And so we have some video that I think we may have skipped one video, and I'm going to go back if we did. Let's see. Yes. You were showing one a moment ago that began with my colleague, former colleague, Janice Rogers Brown, a judge on the DC Circuit, saying about something about the written Constitution. Could we have that video? It's the first video. Just before that, I think.
The written Constitution is all that matters. We, the people, is how it starts.
I'm afraid too many people worship the Constitution. We are being ruled by people who have been dead for 200 years.
How should the living interpret the words of the dead? The debate comes down to the document's original meaning versus a living Constitution.
Originalism is simply the proposition that the meaning of the text of the Constitution must remain the same until it's properly changed.
It's actually very hard to discover often what the original meaning was, because the text of the Constitution often doesn't give you that much guidance.
And I think we delude ourselves if we believe that there is some objective meaning or correct answer.
I don't believe that. If that's true, I can't see the point of having a written Constitution in the first place.
I'm one of the living guys. I believe that the Constitution is ever evolving.
There are going to be circumstances where we have to interpret the meaning of a word. I happen to be fairly limited in how far I'm willing to go.
But originalism does not say, and stick with that through eternity. Article 5 of the Constitution specifically contemplated that the Constitution could and should be amended.
The problem is the Article 5 amendment process is extremely difficult. It's very, very hard. I think the best way to think about a written Constitution is it's a starting point, but it's not the ending point.
Of course, we do our best to understand what the text meant at the time, but for all of the debatable issues, that's a starting point.
If you're a living constitutionalist, it could be whatever you want it to mean. In fact, the only living constitution is a constitution that's followed.
That has almost nothing to do with modern judicial review, because in all modern cases of any importance, the Constitution is not clear.
We're not writing on a blank slate, but we are filling in the blanks and figuring out what the Constitution should be.
The Constitution does evolve, but it evolves slowly. It evolves with the time. It needs to be tweaked.
All of us agree that the Constitution should be updated. What we disagree on is who is to do the updating.
That's what the political process is for, to resolve those difficult questions.
The last people you want to be changing that document are judges.
The judiciary is not licensed by the Constitution to add to or subtract from the text of the Constitution.
What the Supreme Court says it means is not actually the Constitution. The Constitution is the Constitution.
The idea that the Constitution should evolve is really inconsistent with it being the law of the land, the supreme law of the land. The alternative is a law that's forever uncertain, no more stable, no more reliable than popular opinion of the time. Opinions change, mores change. The words don't.
So there you have the flavor of the debate. And of course, when Professor Strauss says the words of the Constitution are not always entirely clear, that's true. That's not a warrant for giving up on trying to know what they were, how they were understood, and what they mean. It opens the door, as you see, as we will see, to judges resolving the constitutional questions in a way that is open to abuse to serve their own prejudices and bias. That's how we got the Dred Scott case that helped bring on the Civil War, in which the Supreme Court, by 7-2, said, well, African Americans could never become citizens, no matter how many generations passed. And how we got Plessy against Ferguson, in which we were told in the 1890s that equal protection of the law, well, separate but equal is okay. That's close enough. And that's just allowing the prejudice of the day to dictate what the outcome is.
And Judge, in your special, you have some great clips about that you develop at great length.
Yeah.
In fact, your special spends a lot of time actually on the incredible tragedy and stain of slavery on our nation, and a little bit of a biography that you do for the Justice Thurgood Marshall, who you clerked with, to develop that even further. So
yes, I mean, he was it's interesting because people who know anything about Justice Marshall's role in the 20th century and in bringing about the civil rights, not revolution, but legal evolution, think that that's what he did all of the time. But he actually spent most of his time defending African Americans accused of rape and murder in the southern states in the 1940s and 30s, 40s, 50s. And his life was always at stake in these. He was close to being lynched in one instance, but the sheriff's deputies. He had to stay with families that were members of the NAACP. It wasn't, if there was a hotel that would take him, it wasn't safe to be there, too easy a target. He's the bravest person I've ever known. And all of that, and then what he accomplished in respect to the civil rights litigation, being an avocation almost, it's an amazing story.
It is an amazing
story. It really is. There's a very good biography of him by Juan Williams. The only fault with which I would say is the subtitle. It's called Thurgood Marshall, American Radical. And he was not radical. He had disdain for radicals, for the back to Africa people, for those who became communists, for even for protesting led by Dr. King. He thought the proper way to do things was in the courts. He was quite conservative in that respect. And he made his point over a period of about 30 years, bringing about the desegregation of our society. Certainly of all of our schools, at least on paper. It took a lot longer in reality, of course. So let's go back to I mentioned the Commerce Clause and its simplicity. The Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the several states. Let's see what happened to that in the hands of the Supreme Court. Do you show the video, please?
Ernest Hemingway slept here. Now they do, descendants of Hemingway's six-toed cats. The Hemingway home is dedicated to preserving the legacy of author Ernest Hemingway and of his cats. In Key West, anything goes. Chickens need no reason to cross the road, or a license for that matter. But when the Federal Department of Agriculture got wind of the museum's cats, it dictated how they should be cared for.
The museum challenged it on Commerce Clause grounds and said these cats are marooned at the very southern tip of Florida, will never cross a state line, and furthermore, they were not bought or sold, they were merely born.
To the framers, commerce meant I send something to you in Boston when I'm in New York. That was interstate commerce of the kind that could be regulated. When two people in the same state traded something, that was not interstate commerce and therefore could not be federally regulated. That was the intention of the framers.
The framers didn't design an almighty federal government that could reach down right into your backyard or barnyard.
World War II, there was a farmer who grew grain, and he fed that grain to his own animals.
And the federal government had a program at the time that dictated how much wheat farmers could grow on their own land. And he said, hey, that's not constitutional. Why? Because I'm not engaged in interstate commerce.
But in Wickard versus Filburn, the highest court in the land thought otherwise.
And in a convoluted analysis, the Supreme Court declared that because that wheat would not be used in interstate commerce, it still impacted interstate commerce through some type of displacement.
So they're taking the Commerce Clause and stretching it like a rubber band to apply to any kind of business when it was originally meant just to be for cross-border commerce, like it says.
I agree, but some scholars disagree. In their view, there's little, if anything, beyond the regulatory authority of the federal government.
In an economy like ours, things really are interconnected. And what goes on one farmer's farm really does affect what happens elsewhere. And so when the Supreme Court says the Interstate Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate things that seem awfully local, it's not just engaging in some kind of trap to expand federal power. It's recognizing an economic reality.
If the test under the Commerce Clause becomes, does it affect commerce, then everything affects commerce, whether you do something or don't do something.
Well, once you have the power over anything that affects commerce amongst the states, then you basically have the power over everything.
Everything? Even Hemingway's cats?
The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and I kid you not, said that because the museum features these cats on its website and has cat-related merchandise in its gift shop, that is a substantial connection to interstate commerce, and that opens the door for the federal government to come in and exert control. Not making that up.
So there you have it. Of course, the federal government would have the authority under any interpretation to regulate the sale of the merchandise from their web store, but not the care of the cats who would live in the house and the grounds at Hemingway's home. So here is if we can show you the next slide, here's what the court actually said. These are its words. Even if Appleby's activity, that is to say, the farmer's activity, be local, and though it may not be regarded as commerce, it may still, whatever its nature, be reached by Congress if it exerts a substantial economic effect on interstate commerce. And this irrespective of whether such effect is what might at some earlier time have been defined as direct or indirect. So it can be local, not regarded as commerce, not interstate, indirect, but having a substantial effect on commerce. That's enough. Now, Alan, you probably know from your law practice that as things have actually worked out and as that's been applied, it's not a substantial economic effect on interstate commerce that's required. The cats don't have that. It is any discernible effect on interstate commerce. But that's how we got to where we are, in which the Congress can regulate literally what goes on in your backyard, as the Environmental Protection Agency does, for instance, if you have some wetland in your backyard. And defining wetland as wet 14 days of the year. You
know, Judge, when I worked at the firm in Washington, I worked for the managing partner. One of the first rules he told me, he said, when you go to any of the administrative agencies, we will never ask them if they have jurisdiction because they will always say they do.
Oh, yeah.
And it's consistent with something I heard more than 40 years ago.
So here's how the Constitution was rewritten. The next slide shows you. The Congress shall have the power to regulate matters substantially affecting commerce among the several states. And again, substantial doesn't really mean substantial. But there it is. It's just a blatant reworking of the text. It's not what we were given. It's not what we're entitled to. Here's another example. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the Takings Clause, beautiful in its simplicity. The framers of the Constitution did not waste words. And by the way, you could read, the whole thing is written on, I think, four pieces of large parchment paper. You could read the whole thing in a little booklet like this in about 15 or 20 minutes. You need a lawyer to read your mortgage or to understand what it means. That's not true of the Constitution. You can get a good sense of it just from reading it. So here's the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment. nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And it's understood by all that just compensation means the market value of the property. So a government, any of the levels of government, can take your property for public use and pay you the market value of the property. And no one disputes that. However, the key is, well, let's take a look at the next video. These are all excerpts from the show.
As a kid growing up with pianos, I remember the first time I ever broke a string, my dad said, "You broke it, Charlie, you're gonna fix it." The first musical director of one of the casinos, he came to me and said, "Charlie, I have a lot of pianos here." So that's what started my career in piano tuning in Atlantic City.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Atlantic City was America's playground. But after World War II, its fortunes declined. The city then gambled on casinos and lost big. Much of America's playground is now a casino wasteland.
This building is not just walls. This building is a cross-section of my life. It's like a living, breathing thing. We were blessed to be able to come as immigrants to this country after what my parents had survived the Holocaust. And the idea of actually owning something that we couldn't be thrown out of was huge.
But maybe Charlie could be thrown out. In 2014, a state judge ruled the Casino Reinvestment Development Authority could seize Charlie's home, using the state's power of eminent domain.
And you have 45 days to vacate, and that it would be bulldozed as all the other buildings right next to me had been bulldozed.
Does the public use provision of the Fifth Amendment have any meaning whatsoever? And the Supreme Court's answer by a 5-4 vote was effectively no.
The Constitution provides that private property may be taken for a public use with just compensation paid. But the Supreme Court rewrote public use to read public purpose, which is much broader.
And the thing that was crazy in the Birnbaum case is they weren't even sure exactly what they were going to use it for or when they were going to use it.
They said, "We don't have to give you an answer." I'm thinking, where do we live? Is this Russia? Is this North Korea?
It's just a naked abuse of government power.
So Charlie went to court. 2 years later, the judge deemed the state's effort to oust Charlie a manifest abuse of the eminent domain power. New Jersey appealed, but in the end, Charlie prevailed. In the infamous case of Kelo versus New London, Suzette Kelo wasn't so lucky. The Supreme Court said, we can't decide what a public purpose is. We'll let the city councils decide that. That's good enough for us. Funny, but I had thought the justices were supposed to make constitutional decisions.
So the battle goes on.
So the Kelo case is the one that was decided by the Supreme Court 5-4 a dozen years ago. And it's representative of just how bad this rewriting of the Constitution can get. Because the City Council of New London, Connecticut, wanted to raise all the houses in a neighborhood near the downtown area. They weren't said to be blighted, but the city wanted to create a space for a pharmaceutical company to build an office campus there. And so the idea was, well, these houses, they pay pretty modest property taxes, but these office buildings and labs that the pharmaceutical company will put up, they will pay a lot of property taxes to the city. And that's what the Supreme Court said was, well, okay, that's a public purpose. How do we know it's a public purpose? Because the city council voted for it. Now, the public purpose isn't going to cut it. It says a public use. And I think anybody asked would say they pretty much know what a public use is, a post office, a school, a road, things of that nature. And nonetheless, the court said basically economic development is a public purpose sufficient to take away your property and pay you for it. So it was such a departure from the text of the Constitution and so consequential and destabilizing that 46 states have said, we're not going to do that. Most of them by legislation, making it clear that they would not use their taking power that way. Some of them by court interpretation. The most protective one in Florida actually says, if a city, a municipality acquires property by eminent domain, it may not resell it for 10 years, so they've got to have some use in mind. And they can't get an exception without a supermajority of the state house, state senate, and the governor's signature. So that isn't going to happen. But short of that, I mean, you know, the federal government retains this power, several states do. And it's really, it's just not in the Constitution. And the Supreme Court, 5-4, blessed it. Well, let's take a look. I think it's 2 slides ahead, if you would, please. And let's just take a look at the Takings Clause as revised. Nor shall private property be taken for a public use, for public purpose, such as economic development that will raise more taxes without just compensation. That's the revised version that the Supreme Court gave us by disregarding the text of the Constitution.
So, Judge, maybe this is a question you don't want to answer because the issue could come before you, but all the 46 states have said they won't do that. They've put laws in place. You have the 4 other states, and you have the federal government. So the federal government could utilize this clause?
Yes, absolutely. And the District of Columbia.
With the expanded 5-4 interpretation.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
So,
yeah, people in those 4 states probably know who they are, too.
So let me, before we go to the questions about the Constitution that pertain to the right to vote, I want to emphasize, because I've watched it actually 3 times, all 3 portions 3 times, not actually an hour. Some of them are only 57 minutes, I think.
Yeah, 55,
so,
55, yeah.
So,
yeah.
But it's, you saw just a few clips here, so I recommend it to everybody in the audience. And the website for that is Free to Choose Network, all one word, like a German, Free to Choose Network.org/Constitution. It's up on, it should be up on the screen now. So I recommend that. Also, there's a companion book, which is great. You do the forward and other parts of that, called Voices of Our Republic, Exploring the Constitution. Ruth Bader Ginsburg also has a piece in there, Sandra Day O'Connor, Ron Chernow, and so many others. And it's available at Amazon.com. And I always want to say this, or wherever books are sold.
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
But those are both great. And the broadcast on PBS is free if you go to that website. If you want, you can buy the DVDs. But if you're a teacher of history or a teacher of civics, if there are any teachers of civics left in our country, but hopefully this will spur that, you can get the DVDs for free. It's also on Amazon Prime and PBS Passport for free to members there. But let's talk.
You have to say something about the teachers.
Please.
The goal of this program was not just to reach the public television audience. It was to get to the teachers of history and civics materials that they could use, because they're desperate for good materials, those that, as you say, still teach history and civics. That element of the curriculum has fallen into such disuse in so many places around the country, so many school systems. We're fortunate to have Free to Choose Network has an affiliate, an educational affiliate, that has 300,000 teachers who want to get their materials. 170,000 of them teach history or civics, and they got the materials either electronically or by DVD, free. So these issues aren't going away. So we will reach about 1 million school children, grades 7 through 12, every year for future years to come.
Well, I think you just answered my question I was about to ask you, which is why did you give 3 years of your life to do this? But it's pretty evident the importance of it.
You know, I teach law at a law school. I have law clerks who come out of law school. But I guess I should stay with those coming in, the first-year law students. Unless they majored in political science in college, they don't know what high school students used to know about civics. They don't know what 8th graders used to know about civics. If they know how a bill becomes a law, it's because they saw Schoolhouse Rock, which is pretty good actually, but they saw a little animated episode about that. And that would be all they know about the legislative process. So we have a generation of increasingly ignorant young people. And it's really striking if you compare the output of our secondary schools now with what they were. Look at the exams if you ever had a chance to, what you needed to know to be graduated from 12th grade or even 8th grade longer ago. We've just let this slip, and we have a citizenry who vote, so many of whom were never exposed to any of these ideas or materials.
I think it's a grave danger to the republic. What you don't understand, you don't value. And if we don't value the freedom and democratic principles that are incorporated, deriving from the Constitution, we could lose all that, and that would be a travesty, not just for our country and our citizens, but the whole world.
It's happened before, and you're right to be concerned about it. It could happen here.
Well, let's turn to the election or the portions of the Constitution that directly implicate voting. And in the time we have, we'll go quickly. But in Article 1, the first article of the Constitution, Section 2, there's the three-fifths compromise. Could you just speak briefly about that, so be sure everybody understands how that...
Well, first of all, understand that the Constitution is, in its most important parts, the product of compromise. These 13 sovereign states that came together existed in a loose confederation under the Articles of Confederation, and it was falling apart. The economy was in deep depression because they erected trade barriers. People couldn't sell goods across state lines without paying a tax. They issued their own currencies. The Congress could not support an army. It did not have the power to tax. So they came together, these very diverse states, most important, I should say, large states and small states, populous and not, and slave states and free states. Slavery was not unknown in any state at that time, but there were very few slaves in New England and upstate New York, or anywhere in New York, or Pennsylvania. So forging a constitution out of this required a great deal of compromise. And one of the compromises is the three-fifths clause. First one was that there would be two houses of the Congress, of the legislature. Initially, Madison's Virginia plan had both houses apportioned by population. So clearly the small states weren't going to sign on. Delaware and South Carolina and probably even New Jersey, Connecticut, we're not going to have it. So that compromise was, well, we'll have population governing the allocation of seats in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate, we would have representation by state. And in the actual Constitutional Convention, there were 13 votes cast by the delegations from each of the states. In the Senate, there would be 2 senators from each state, and they could vote individually as they desired. Well, what about the population count? The southern states said, well, we want to count the enslaved people in determining how many votes we're entitled to in the seats in the House of Representatives. And the basically northern and non-slave states said that's completely out of the question. You don't let them vote. Why would they be represented in your congressional delegation? Well, there was no way to resolve that except by a compromise. There's no principled answer to that question of what to do if you're going to have a union instead of 2 or 3 or 5 different countries coming out of the convention. And so the compromise was that in the census, the slave population would be counted as 3/5 of their total. It's not something that was meant to denigrate the enslaved people as being only 3/5 of a person. It was a mathematical way of allocating the seats in the Congress. And that carried the day. That they managed to get that through and accepted. So that's basically anybody who hasn't encountered this in civics or history doesn't know what I just said.
Right.
They think it was just some sort of insult.
It was a way to create our republic.
Nonetheless,
Because you had those 13 separate states which were sovereign. They were like separate countries.
Absolutely. And they were very jealous of their powers. The main compromise was how much to give to the federal government. States had all of the powers. And the question was how much power to give to this new federal government. They knew they needed a stronger federal government, central government. They knew that because in the 6 months before, the convention got together in May in Philadelphia. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, led by farmers who were veterans of the Revolutionary War and who'd not been paid their pensions because the federal government couldn't raise a tax to pay them, began an insurrection. And it wasn't put down by the federal government, and it wasn't put down by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It was put down by merchants in Boston paying an army to do this. So everybody knew they had to create a stronger central government. Now, one of the consequences of the 3/5 clause was that to that extent, it gave the slave states, one could say disproportionate, certainly greater
compared to how many people could really vote.
And what happened? 5 of the first 7 presidents were from Virginia.
Yeah.
So these things have consequences.
But then slavery is ended by the Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, only in the military districts.
And then after the war,
yes,
the 13th, 14th, and we get to the 15th Amendment, which was to give, well, why don't I ask you to describe it, which is 150 years old this past February.
Yes,
describe
1870.
the aspirations of the 15th Amendment.
Yes. So, well, I happen to have it with me as always.
It's not a long one.
Nothing special about today in that regard. It's very short and to the point. The 15th Amendment, February 1870. Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote. And by the way, in the 13th Amendment, the former slaves had been made citizens of their states and of the United States. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So in 1870, the last of the former Confederate states were rejoining the Union. And they basically had to ratify the 15th Amendment in order to be admitted back into the Congress. The last 4, I think, ratified the 15th Amendment in late 1869 and the first days of 1870. Now, it's one thing to amend the Constitution to say that those rights to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, etc.
But the reality,
another thing to make it a reality.
Right.
And starting in around 1890, well, of course, there was a Reconstruction period when there was a federal occupation of the southern states. And hundreds, I think actually several thousand former slaves were elected to office, to local and sometimes state house elections. But starting in 1890, the federal government had withdrawn, long gone, and there was a move in this Jim Crow, so-called Jim Crow era, to disenfranchise the African American voters.
Yeah.
And one of there were a lot of techniques and artifices used for this purpose. One of them was a poll tax. It was usually $1 or as much as $2, which would be $20 or $40 today. But to make it a particular, which was a lot of money particularly for a lot of people, disproportionately for blacks, but for the whites as well. Poor whites were disenfranchised at the same time. And then there might be a requirement that you pay the poll tax 6 months before the election and then show the receipt at the election. Some states said you had to pass a voter exam, and they would read some obscure portion of the Constitution and ask you to explain it or quote it or what have you. these are all underhanded devices for
So basically for 95 years at least, the great portion of our humanity and the country and citizens were disenfranchised, even though the 15th Amendment should have applied to them.
Yes, about 6% in the southern states, about 6% continued to vote. That was about it.
Right, but that other 94% still counted, no longer 3/5. That's why I asked you to go to the 3/5, because they only got 3/5 before. Now they're getting 5. They're getting a whole person in credit, but they're precluding them from voting.
Right.
So a small group was still controlling a lot more.
Right.
And you mentioned the poll tax, and there was an amendment to take that away, but not till the 24th Amendment, I believe.
The 24th it is, and that came in 1962, I think.
I think 64, but
64. It was passed in 62, ratified by the Congress, ratified by the states in 1964. So here's what that says, and it's pretty interesting, actually. The right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election. Now, rights of citizens of the United States, that's the blacks too, that's everybody.
Right.
For president or vice president, for electors for president or vice president, or for senator or representative in Congress, so just for federal offices, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by reason of the failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. And even some non-monetary obligations were held unconstitutional as effectively a tax. For instance, you could pay a tax, or I think it was take the exam, and they said, well, that's just as bad. Taking the exam, not an option. You can't burden the right to vote that way. But this applied only to federal elections. And then later on, a couple of years later, in '66. The Supreme Court had a case called Harper against the Virginia Board of Elections, and by a vote of 6 to 3, held that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment made it unconstitutional to deny the right to vote in state elections based on a poll tax.
Right.
So for a couple of years, there could be a poll tax to vote in the state and local election, but not to vote in the federal election. Which was very impractical for actually getting the vote out.
And just thinking about 1870 all the way until the 24th Amendment, 1964, but until the Civil Rights Act, 64, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So you're 95 years from when the 15th Amendment was passed before really significant progress is made. And of course, the funeral today of John Lewis brings that all home quite vividly.
Well, so the Voting Rights Act, 1965, just a year after the amendment is passed, and that authorizes the federal government to really supervise the fairness of elections based on race, fairness of elections in a list of states. And that's been mitigated now. The Supreme Court has said that some of the provisions are no longer justified.
I was just about to say there's quite a dispute about that Supreme Court case, and we don't have time for that, I know, but maybe after this, you and I can debate that a little. I did want to mention, I want to mention having grown up in Washington, D.C., in the District of Columbia, from a family that's been there since the 1800s, and no one in the district had been empowered or authorized or enfranchised to vote in presidential elections until 1961. So my father, my grandfather, et cetera, all those years living in the district, couldn't vote until 1961. And I was born, when I turned 18, I couldn't vote because you couldn't vote until you were 21. So there's two amendments. The 23rd Amendment gave the right to vote into residents of the district, and the 26th Amendment gave the right to vote to all 18-year-olds around the country.
Yes, that was probably product of its times with the Vietnam War raging and young men being conscripted and so on. But looking at the state of the education of 18-year-olds, you'd have to say it was not a wise idea in the long run.
Well, I was able to buy alcohol at 18, not that I did, frankly, but
well, you could do that and go right to the polling place.
Now you can't do it till you're 21. So that was a flip. I'm not sure it was a good trade.
By the way, your mother and grandmother couldn't vote.
Yes.
In the district.
Well, I was going to ask you about the 19th Amendment. So why don't you talk about that's 117 days from today. It'll be the 100th anniversary of the ratification.
Right. But the struggle for the women's franchise began in 1870 in the United States and approximately then in the United Kingdom. And it gained ground over time, but the First World War interrupted things. The First World War was an occasion for the suffrage movement in both countries, by the way, to pretty much call a truce with their respective governments on the understanding that when the war was over, they would get action. And in 1920, the amendment was ratified. I think it was probably, I don't know if it was enacted by the Congress in 1918 or 19.
I think it's ratified in effect
the same year as it was.
In 1920.
Ratified by the states, but I mean passed by the Congress and sent to the states. I think that was the year before.
Yes.
Right
yes.
after the war ended,
right,
basically. Right. So that was a long struggle. In 1870, I think 1870 or 73.
Well, some of the people women who'd been fighting the abolitionists had some hope that when the 15th Amendment came in, that it would also address women.
Which didn't happen.
Didn't happen. Right. Said male.
So the Supreme Court had a case in the early 1870s of a woman who was denied admission to the Illinois bar. She'd completed the requirements, but was not admitted, and challenged that as a denial of equal protection, and the Supreme Court upheld the Illinois bar's exclusion, which they pretty quickly after that rescinded. But getting the vote was a long way off.
Well, let me ask you one more question, and then we'll take a few questions before they make us stop. But that's about the 17th Amendment. And how would Susan Collins, the senior Republican senator, woman senator today, how would her campaign be different right now if the 17th Amendment had never been passed?
Well, I think what you're getting at is the point that under the 17th Amendment, well, pardon me, under the original Constitution, the senators were to be elected by the state legislatures. And that was the practice, but it began to tail off early on in the 19th century, I think starting in 1824, where some of the states started to change that. They couldn't change the Constitution. They had to send senators who'd been voted in by their legislature, but they could do things to require their senators to send the people that were popularly elected. So they would have a popular election. It was not binding, but they would then require, as a practical matter, sometimes as a legal matter, require their senators to vote for those people to be the state senators in Washington. Now, that amendment was ratified by changing that, saying direct election of senators was ratified in 1913, and that took, I'm not sure what the number of states was then, but it took well over 30 states to do that. And indeed, there were only a half a dozen or fewer states that hadn't already provided for direct election. And so in 1912, there was a referendum in Maine, and by referendum, the voters approved a provision in the Maine statutes that required that there be a primary. We now had party politics, unlike at the founding, that each party have a primary, and that the winner of their primary would be would have to be elected by the legislature to be the senators, the winners of the general election, right, coming out of that primary. And that was in 1912. So if Senator Collins were running then, nothing would have been different because Maine was ahead of the amendment, as were most of the states.
Oh, very good. All right. I didn't realize that.
Now, in fairness, I wouldn't have known that had Alan not told me he might ask me that.
Well done. Well prepared, Your Honor. Did we have some questions from the audience? I thought you were going to put them on a screen for me, but I haven't seen that. So there we go. Well, I think we only have a couple of minutes, so let me just see if I can see those. And some of those are a little unclear. Actually, but let me, would you classify, can you see, do you think the courts have become more politicized since the voting change in the U.S. Senate by Senator Reid?
Okay, so this refers to the fact that in sometime, I don't remember the year, but sometime during the previous administration, around that 2016 or so, The custom, until then, the custom had been that appointments to the courts, nominees for the courts, were could be held up if they couldn't get 60 votes for having a vote on the merits. Right? It's the filibuster rule. Senate Rule 22 provides that it used to be 2/3, then it was 2/3 of those present. Now it's 60 votes, which could be required in order to debate something.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2016, I think it was, Senator Reid, who was the majority leader, said he's no longer going to apply the filibuster to judicial appointments. And that cleared the way for a number of judges to be confirmed who had been held up because they couldn't get 60 votes to have a debate. And he said, now this is just for the courts of appeals. This is not the Supreme Court, or maybe the courts of appeals and the trial courts. But it was inevitable. It was obvious to everybody, and it must have been obvious to Senator Reid.
The classic slippery slope.
The first time that a Supreme Court nomination came up, they would have the same problem of getting 60 votes, and so they would say, well, it doesn't apply.
Right.
So that's what's happened. So we now have a simple majority of 51 votes required to confirm, or simple majority. It doesn't have to be 51 if there are fewer voting, but anyway, a simple majority. Now that means that over the, I think in answer to the direct question, no, it has not had a discernible effect in politicizing the courts yet. But the inevitable tendency of this over time is going to be that increasingly presidents will nominate people with whom they want confirmed, who could not get 51 votes because they are too extreme in their views one way or another. I mean, I think it would have been ideal to have a constitutional requirement of 2/3 or 60 for at least 60 for confirming judges. But we don't have that. It's a more or less perfect union. That's one of the ways I would improve it.
Right.
But we've gone just the other way, and it's not coming back.
Okay. Well, I think we've been told a little while ago we were out of time. So I'll turn it back over to our host and thank the Champlain Institute, but particularly thank you, Judge. It's an honor to be with you.
Thanks, Alan. It's been a pleasure for me, and I hope others have enjoyed it.
And I hope everybody watches your full PBS special.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Ginsburg. Thank you, Alan.
Pleasure.
That's going to conclude this evening's discussion, and I welcome you back to join us tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Josh Silver and Will Thorndike will be talking, and then in the evening at 5, I'll be joined with Wes Moore. So until tomorrow, thanks for coming.